This is the Cruciform Conversations podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflections Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Well, welcome to Cruciform Conversations, where we are pursuing a cross-shaped life, one where the self-giving love of God allows us to participate in God's healing of the world. My name is Greg Arthur, and my guest today is my friend Hank Spaulding. Hank, thanks for always saying yes when I ask you to come and talk about whatever random subject I want to talk about that time.
It's always a pleasure.
If you're unfamiliar with Hank's work, Dr. Hank Spaulding's a gifted theologian and ethicist who's a professor, pastor, writer. He's done a lot of research and writing around sexual ethics in particular. His most recent book, I've got it right here, Iconoclastic Sex, explores Christian sexual ethics and human trafficking. And I asked if he would join me to talk about some of the big questions that we are both thinking about in this particular cultural moment when it comes to Christian sexual ethics. This series is part of a larger series of articles doing on the Substack around cruciform sexuality. We're really trying to get into a reframing and a reimagination of the conversations that we're having about sex and sexuality through the lens of the cross and this self-giving love of God. We want to approach these questions with humility and curiosity to understand not just what it is we believe, but why we believe it. What are the cultural influences? What are the historical realities? And what does a redemptive view of sexuality look like for us in our day? So we're going to get into all sorts of things. As an important note with that, we are having an open-ended conversation about sexuality and ethics, and we may dive into areas of exploitation or abuse that are hard for some to listen to. We will do so with as much care and compassion as we possibly can, but we do want to issue that disclaimer up front. Hank, I'm going to throw you open to you first. What is a big question that you are wrestling with right now in regards to Christian sexual ethics in this particular moment in which we're living?
Well, I think that, one of the pieces that is really starting to become more and more of an issue is the question of AI and human sexuality. It's taking a form in a couple different ways. I mean, there was a kind of a semi-famous news story a couple months ago. I don't know if you covered it or not on your Substack or maybe even here in your podcast, but there was a young woman who had developed a relationship with her chat GPT that she had kind of named and kind of shaped after herself or something like that. But she basically developed kind of a close relationship with that chat GPT that basically like she would go to school, come home, do her homework, and then just spend the rest of her time basically talking with her chat GPT as if it was a friend or a boyfriend or things like that. And so that's a really interesting thing. I mean, something that's very much was science fiction a few years ago. Right. For those who maybe are familiar with the film Her? With Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah.
And Scarlett Johansson it seemed kind of far-fetched at the time, but these days it kind of seems like it's not actually too far-fetched at all.
It feels a bit more prophetic, actually, that it wasn't even that far into the future that this was an actual question now people were going to wrestle with and a potential reality for some.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way in which that forms attachments, we form attachments to those things. I know that several friends of mine who use ChatGPT professionally to help I think come up with formulas for Excel sheets and things like that, like people who are in the tech world and business world, like they have kind of semi-close attachments with ChatGPT, but we're also getting even further down the road in terms of developing kind of more robot interface kind of AI companions as well, like actual physical companions that could be in the house. I think are they Mios? Is that right? Am I thinking about those? Is that right? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I mean, I've very cursory knowledge, but I've seen some coverage on it.
Yeah. And so the reason why that's such a big topic is that, it's for me, and this goes back to kind of my earlier work on sexual ethics and exploitation, is that it seems that for us as humans, when it comes to sexuality, a lot of times the question is about control. And now I don't think necessarily that is something that people come to, I would say maliciously. I think some people do very much so, they want to absolutely control a situation and have no variables associated with it. I know that some people prefer that if they come from a background of abuse, they know that like, ChatGPT is never going to hurt them or something like that, that there's in the programming that it's not supposed to be. I know that, in earlier iterations of ChatGPT, there was some situations of a little bit of worrisome in terms of the coding, in terms of what it was doing and exposing kids to. But for the people who are using it now, there's kind of a self-confession that you don't really have to worry about abuse in those situations. And so what I think that it does negatively on the side of both like the person who wants like control to exploit and the person who wants control so that they are not exploited is that we're moving away from increasingly the ability to enter into, I think, complex human relationships with one
Yeah.
another and all the intricacies that that comes with. And I think that that is like, I mean, for generations ago, we would have not thought of that as like a life skill that one could
Yeah.
or could not develop, but nonetheless, it's something that I think that we're losing touch with because it's the humanity of another person, uncontrollability, right? Their kind
Mhm.
of uniqueness, the ways in which they contribute to human flourishing in their own ways that are not really dictated or, really put forward by us as an individual who's pursuing a relationship with them. And so what that does is it makes it almost impossible to develop, I think, what are called healthy attachments to individuals without entering into like either voyeurism or, I mean, like you could even think about this as in terms of like pornography or something like that, something where there's one person absolutely using the other person for their own purposes and means. I mean, they're just now using AI for that. That's the thing that I think is probably, the big question that I have is that what happens to human attachments when we're no longer able to make healthy attachments to one another, especially when it comes to sexuality.
Yeah, there's a host of layers there.
Hmm.
And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and even trying to engage with my 23-year-old and 19-year-old in conversations around the dinner table about um,
Hmm.
what eh, what becomes of us as humans when we replace, as you just said, the complex nature of human interaction and relationship
Hmm.
with anything that's transactional or created in such a way as to remove the complexity. What is fundamentally altered for us when that becomes our reality?
Hmm.
And for some, as you're naming, because of situations of abuse or vulnerability, like if this is even true with like there are some like therapist chatbots, right? Or even like, AI Jesus, right? You can talk
Yeah.
to, or AI chatbots for confession in the church.
Hmm.
Every variation of this exists, right?
Right.
That there is a sense of, because it feels safe,
Hmm.
it performs a function on a level. Okay, that's an interesting conversation to have. Beyond that, however,
Right.
is if we never have any relationship that emerges beyond that level of safety and control, then much of what we talk about with the fruit of the spirit of moral formation, it's not possible because you are not in a relationship with a
Hmm.
human.
Hmm. Right. Yeah.
Cannot occur in this, at least not in a fully developed, flourishing way within that.
Hmm.
So now we have eliminated that from the actual lived experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I remember, so Ray Kurzweil, who's been kind of like a champion of this for a generation now. He wrote The Singularity is Near. He actually wrote a sequel to it recently. The Singularity is Nearer. He's a big favorite of a lot of billionaire people like Elon Musk and even somebody like Bill Gates. They really like him. He wrote in that book about how he thought about a way to solve his dilemma as like a fourth grader because he had a really big crush on his fourth grade teacher is to implant kind of some kind of like AI technology into his brain to where he could live out a fantasy with his fourth grade teacher with unbeknownst to her, kind of in the comfort and safety of his own mind. And kind of one of the things that I think about as it relates to that, because that solves a problem. It's like in the same way that this AI companionship does solve a problem, in the sense of like you don't have to deal with people now if you think that they are unsafe and stuff like that, or whatever fetish you have, you can exact on this AI person instead of like really thinking through whether or not that's a healthy thing to be doing in general. But the thing that this example made me think about is that, are we better off as a society where every fourth grader can kind of just like make a person subject to the sexual whims of their desire at any point, any time? I mean, as you say, like with that, like with the fruits of the spirit, that's a great example. Like we lack the ability, whenever that becomes the case, to form and develop and question like what is healthy attachment, what is healthy sexual practice, because instead you can just do whatever you want without ever actually like maybe harming somebody physically. But it does not mean that you're developed and formed and shaped morally in a way that we would consider as I mean, as just like a moral community as something healthy. I mean, some like develop like really healthy sexual attachments to individuals. Cause I mean, that's, I think, a part about growing up in relationships and things about human nature that's essential, is that there needs to be that kind of work where you develop in conversation with other people, like these healthy attachments. And it starts from when you're a kid, it goes all the way up until you're an adult. It's not other people's responsibility, it's a shared work, just like with any kind of
Hmm.
moral formation.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, like when you take that away, then no attachment is out of bounds, no desire or activity is off base. And so you have this, in a sense, a society where it's just completely hedonistic in a real sense, and you don't really get to moral formation and what that actually looks like. And so that's one of my big concerns, is the fact that like we're developing a generation of people. I mean, and older generations are redeveloping really unhealthy sexual habits that I think are very problematic for us as a whole. I mean, granted, you can think about it in a whole host of things, because AI isn't just in the realm of human sexuality either. I mean, you can think about it in terms of warfare, completely distancing ourselves from the battlefield, where enemy combatants are no longer represented as human casualties, but just merely almost as like video game stats, things like that.
Right. If you're flying a drone in Las Vegas, but
Hmm.
you're blowing up people, in Syria, and
Right.
for that.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, and that's the thing that's so interesting. I mean, the Secretary of Defense announced yesterday that the AI bot Grok from X will be incorporated more into the Department of Defense, and so will Google's AI companion. And so, I mean, for me, who grew up in the '80s and '90s, that's Skynet all over again.
I mean, we
Um,
have we have so many movies that cover this, right?
yeah,
Even
it's
going back to Matthew Broderick and War Games, right? Like we
yep,
have laid this out, people. Like there's no need to.
yeah. It's
This is
it's just
well
like at
explored
this point.
territory.
I know, it's one of those things that I'm just like, this is like, we have no one else to blame but ourselves. So because this has been very well covered. So, but yeah, like I mean, the same thing's true. So like a decreasing in our world AI, for all of its benefits, and I think there are things that AI does that helps out people, I think, with like intellectual learning kind of accessibility challenges. Like there are ways in which those individuals can be helped out by AI, and there's things that AI can do to help make life more efficient and positive ways. But nonetheless, I think one of the things that AI does is it decreases the value of the human in any sector that it's involved in,
Yes.
because it has to value its own ends rather than like it values efficiency instead of formation. It values like a particular kind of view of what it looks like to be human rather than like the messy intricateness of like what humanness has been historically.
Yeah. So all right. So let's. There was, I think, there was a couple more layers in that are really helpful and things that I've been really thinking about as well.
Mhm.
You bring up attachment theory. Shout out to my friend Jeff Holtzclaw, who I've had several conversations at the podcast with, and point to his
Yeah.
stuff. Really helpful stuff on attachment theory. But that's one particular lens that's helpful because it helps us think about how we attach to God and how we are shaped morally, spiritually through the loving presence of God. I might
Mhm.
even say the loving gaze of God. One of your
Mhm.
other works, right?
Yes, yes.
This is how we're shaped. So it is hard enough already in life with how hard our relationships are, how hard our parental relationships are, people around us. It is hard enough already pastorally, as we're trying to help people with therapists, everybody I talk to, trying to help people find that place of secure attachment with God
Mm,
so that they can find healing, reconciliation, and be able then to go into the world and love
right.
people in the same way.
Hmm.
That's the end of the Christian life, to love God and to love our neighbor. But we have to be able to actually love God and live in that secured relationship with that in order to love our neighbor. All of these buffers, layers that pull us further away from actual human interaction and having to learn how to navigate that, to me, just set us up to have an increasingly difficult time imagining what any secure attachment to God's going to be like, because it's not
Hmm.
going to be like talking to a chat GPT or any bot that's created, right? That's not going to exist. So I'm very concerned about how do we shape and form humans that can flourish in the loving gaze of God, that can be connected in a healthy way to God, if we are continually removing ourselves out of actual lived relationship with other humans and all the mess of it and all the work of it, which requires the grace of God and compassion to navigate well
Hmm.
and bring healing to anyways.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really excellent way to frame all of that because, I mean, I think it was St. Teresa of Avila who said that, God not being present as a human anymore in Jesus Christ, but being present through the Holy Spirit, it can be a little bit difficult to relate to such a being. But God has given us our neighbor as a way to do that. And I think you're right to put your finger on it, like by removing our neighbor from the equation and kind of centering ourselves as the main object of like discernment about the person of God, I think
Hmm.
is quite challenging. And one of the elements, I mean, you look at scripture, for example, I mean, if you look at the like Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, the way that God has relationships with Israel, for example, like walking them through the desert and making them have to rely on God through prayer alone, experiencing hardships and struggle as they are kind of deeply shaped and formed on what it means to leave behind the efficiency of slaveholding Egypt behind them and
Hmm.
embracing instead this kind of freedom of God, which looks like this kind of wilderness wandering. I mean, even when you move into like the New Testament and even like Christian like history, I mean, the connecting with God through the liturgy or through worship, through the development of the sacraments. I mean, sacraments are not a technology to be exploited to gain
Hmm.
control over God. It's something that we have to kind of place ourselves in submission to, something that is beyond our control and beyond our ability to really fully grasp. And so these are mysteries that we partake in instead of, like a technology. ChatGPT, I mean, ChatGPT Jesus, for example, like he, like he'll answer you right away. Like it's very
Right, right.
efficient.
There's very efficient. There's an immediacy to it. Man, it feels
Yes,
good.
it does. It does. That's the thing. It's like we've what AI has done is it's made us, if nothing else, less patient because we don't have to like really lean into things. We don't have to wait for things. We don't have to
Mm.
develop. And patience is one of those things that is, I think, a crucial virtue in the Christian life, not just for how we interact with God, but how we interact with other people. And that's, again, it's intimately connected, as you pointed out. How we interact with others is how we ultimately form attachments to God. And so being patient is important. I mean, because God is ultimately patient with us. And so when we lose that sense of patience, I think we lose not only an important character virtue for us, but also an essential understanding of the character of God as well.
And it seems, going back to your example, thinking about Israelites in the wilderness, this whole thing
Hmm.
of being reshaped and formed out of from an enslaved people, and how it took a generation, right, to be people reshaped around being Yahweh's people, and what did that look like in the ethics of that, and how do they live differently? A big part of that was removing idolatry as a
Hmm.
shortcut to relationship. This is the golden calf, right? They grew tired of waiting while Moses was gone. So
Hmm.
they created an idol to help them shortcut the process of feeling connected to God, knowing what to do, getting a response. This is what idols do for us, right? It takes the place of, because we're anxious about something. We want to
Hmm.
speed up the process. We want to know, if I do this, I get this. And
Hmm.
God doesn't allow that intermediary for us in our connection,
Hmm.
because instead it is a trusting, loving, faithful relationship through which we
Hmm.
are shaped and formed to offer that to the world. And so, yeah, I think idolatry is a helpful attachment to a lens for what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can't make this stuff up in terms of how it maps itself onto things like AI. Like it is fascinating to see how humans kind of make the same mistakes again and again and again. Um, and that's a big one. Like our inability to fundamentally wait and sit with God and things like that. Our inability to sit in silence, is huge.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the elements in which like these things kind of trickle down into our relationships with each other too.
And it's not hard for the sell for this of moving relationships virtually isn't hard for me to understand. Everything's complex with another human. But
Right.
especially when it comes to adding in the intimacy of sexuality and
Hmm.
the bodily realities of that and how that's just woven into who we are as people. It is a vulnerable existence we have when it comes to our sexuality.
Right.
So pulling that out of the messiness, difficulty, frustrations, struggles of actually having another human that you're committed to with that, to some sort of lesser version that has immediacy, that then plays into perhaps, as we say, like the immediate threat, right, and concern for me when it came to a lot of the AI generated content
Hmm.
and these robots was knowing with your research, I know you've done it within this and what you've lived in, what I've done is the first thing that's going to happen to come out of this is exploitative material. It's going to be pornographic material involving children. It's going to be abusive. It's going to be coercive. It is going to violate all of the protections we have around that and give people the ability then morally to just say, what is the worst part of me that is held in check by shame, guilt, the law, other physical boundaries, relationships, and what if I remove all of those and can just explore that?
Hmm.
I can't there's a horror waiting on the other end of that as humans without any of
Yes.
those checks, and it does not seem like the tech companies are all that interested in providing those.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And the challenge has always been when it comes to, I mean, and this is where I first came into my study of Christian sexual ethics, is there's always been a sense of privilege about sexual ethics. There's always been the privilege of those who have been able to kind of choose though their own sexual activities and those who have not.
Mm,
And what happens is that even though these realities and AI and generated content create for us, the perfect scenario, there's always this desire to try and actualize it in real space. And you're right. And the deformation that permits these kinds of desires in the place of healthy, constructive ones
mhm,
in that AI artificial spaces becomes kind of like a crucible where we
mm,
lose those kinds of morally forming checks and balances of what we would normally like encounter in terms of community, in terms of like other people. And then when we finally reach real like human people, we are just there to exploit and harm because that's all we've been shaped and formed in doing. That's the kind of one of the studies that has been done when it comes to pornography, is that people like get dissatisfied with it, kind of like a drug hit. They just need more and more to satisfy their original kind of like high that they experience through engaging in that content. And so you have to reach outside of merely just the internet space and actualize it in some exploited human. Those things are still realities that are tremendously impacting our world around us. I mean, just all of this. I mean, you can just look at the news and just the way in which trafficking and exploitation, especially sexual exploitation of minors and women all around the world, is a daily headline. And the way in which kind of those things play themselves out is troubling in our current political landscape. But yeah, like it's
mm,
just there's always that sense in which when you are deformed that
mm.
way, when you come to interact with humans, it's going to be in a way that escalates that deformation onto another person. And so it's a very risky challenge with the increasing amount of AI that we have out there as well.
Yeah, and the effects of the pornification of sexuality in this culture are probably really a helpful guide for what we're thinking about because in my work with men for a lot of years, it's been a lot of trying to understand the effects of not just the availability of pornography, but the pornification of sex and the transformation of it in that space and its impact. And one of the impacts has been it's in some regards actually, like you said, completely removed a generation of men from actual lived sexual relationships with anybody
Mhm.
else.
Yeah.
that because it has shaped and malformed in so many different ways, that there isn't it didn't a lot of the conversation was, this is gonna drive this huge increase in sexual activity and promiscuity, whatever, and it's actually sort of done the opposite, and in some ways,
Mhm.
almost like it's a virtual castration of, like,
Yep.
pulling those, who use it and are shaped by it, shamed by it, out of actual relationship and lived experience. And I think that we're good just going to see if there is a proliferation of artificial intelligence as the supplement and the replacing of human interaction on relational
Mhm.
levels, on emotional levels, on spiritual levels, and on sexual levels. It is just going to continue, like you said, to deform us or malform us away from any form of healthy attached relationship.
Mhm.
And absolutely, that's going to deeply impact what we think sexuality is or how it's lived out.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a I mean, that's a whole other can of worms that you mentioned there too. Like what happens when the very idea of human connection becomes so dissatisfying that it's not even one of an options that we'll consider or we
Right.
can consider, we're capable of considering. I mean, I think that's that name a really crucial big problem there when it comes to what AI can ultimately do to human relationships is make us incapable of one another.
And we're seeing this in the last, 30 years with the church, with
Mm.
the movement into virtual Christianity of how do we consume content? What do we consider? Who are the thinkers who shape and form us? What does it mean to worship? We're doing a podcast right now, right? Like
Right.
we're gonna be on Substack, like on social media.
Right.
Like this is not like some like Luddite
That's right. Yeah.
diatribe against all this, but it's naming that the implications of that have been increasingly uh, um, we often aren't in any actual relationship with the people who are shaping and forming our faith, and that has massive ramifications. As a pastor going through a lot of the ideological changes in the last decade and what's been exposed, I know I sat down with conversations with people that I deeply love, that been in my house, baptized or been there for their families, prayed for their sick family members, experienced miracles together, led worship together, and the conversations we were having was I wasn't actually talking to them. I was talking to YouTube personalities that they spent 3 or 4 hours a day watching. And those were the people that were shaping and forming them. And when I
Mhm.
asked questions about, I'm the one actually here with you. Why is there no, not that I'm a claiming authority, it was just like, I'm
Right.
the one who actually loves you and can speak into your life. Why does that have no value in comparison to this? So we've already seen that and how it's impacted the church and has driven polarization and pulling us away. So, this is not necessarily new in that regards either.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's only ever I mean, it's only getting worse in that regards too because, these technologies further silo us from, one another and those things, and I mean, you mentioned it too, like the great crisis, I think, in a lot of churches in, North America especially, has been the fact that people can kind of and, generation former, it was go down to the local Christian bookstore and pick up a book that looks interesting and then determine my theology based on that versus
Yeah,
what I hear
right.
from the pulpit, in any given thing like that. That's a big deal. But now it's right. It's internet personalities. It's people who have a platform, who can do that. That's the challenge. Like, how do you get through to people who have accepted what they like the market share of what orthodoxy is rather than what orthodoxy can actually be in terms
Yeah.
of this liberating, freeing teachings of Jesus and things like that. So, I mean, it is relatively challenging. I mean, my favorite is the fact that the word biblical Christianity has come to mean something other than what the Bible actually teaches. That it's
Yeah.
just it's gone so far afield. It's almost hilarious if it wasn't so sad. But the
Mhm.
ideas, of course, have just like gone so far afield because they've been manipulated by a great, wave of kind of just polarization, as you mentioned, and that's really challenge, deep challenge.
Well, here's something I've been thinking about closely related to this,
Hmm.
but tying back into the research we've done around human trafficking and the commodification of sexuality,
Hmm.
which is nothing new, just showing up differently via the economic realities of a globalized world that, the
Hmm.
globalized economy that we're living in right now. I've been really interesting, read some different articles, but trying to ask the question, what does the rise of OnlyFans just tell us about
Hmm.
or reveal to us about the interconnectedness of sex and money and the sexual economy that is
Hmm.
taking place?
Yeah.
That's the question I've been wrestling with. So I want to see if you have any thoughts up front around that because I know you've written and thought about that, but I've been trying to
Yeah.
gather my thoughts on what it's revealing to me.
Yeah, and it's a challenge because I mean, going back to the church, it's there's a difficulty right now with the church in terms of how it is approaching the issue of sexuality. Right now, the church believes, I mean, not all of the church, it's not everyone, but a large portion of the church believes that you just really should ignore it and not talk about it, and it'll just kind of go away on its own. And there's nothing that could be more paralyzing in this time than to just ignore it because it's, stuff's going to happen and you need to be prepared when you're, 14-year-old comes to you and tells you that they have started an OnlyFans or something like that. And what are you going to say and do about it rather than just tell them that they're going to hell or something like that? I mean, this
Which
is huge.
just for note, per my understanding, having not been on OnlyFans and whatever, there at least is some verification process
Yeah.
for age and consent that is supposed to elevate out
Yes.
of some of the more exploitative platforms, right?
Yes. They
But
are. Yeah.
we just want to name that, but like that's actually part of the
Hmm.
appeal
Hmm.
of it. There is an element of consent woven into the transactional nature and who is benefiting off of this that is
Oh yeah.
different than other platforms, right? So anyway, just want to name that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was. I mean, this platform was originally invented just as like a content platform for people who just like, for example, if you had a favorite comedian, it was meant to be a place where that comedian could like send out exclusive content on stuff that they do, and it very quickly became known as the sexual content platform, just because that's just what humans do. But you're right about that. Like the big thing that it did was it allowed or it gave permission to content creators to actually own their work. Previously, like especially in terms of when you think about like the companies that controlled the mass distribution of pornography and things like that, they controlled it, and so it was very exploitative because the desire, like move was to always create the material that was going to be the most satisfying to the customer. And so wherever that market moved is where you had to go as a creator, or else you weren't going to earn a living. When you go onto OnlyFans, you can choose what you want to do. You can choose what kind of content you want to do, and you own all the rights and all that kind of stuff to it. Early on, one of the problems is that you would still have people who would like be a part of these like people who own kind of, I guess, a ring of kind of prostitution would start one and then just kind of put their content there. My understanding is that that's been kind of like clamped down on a bit. One of the things that, how do we think about like sexuality and OnlyFans? Like, I think that we have to assume a place, a posture of listening. It's easy to condemn. And obviously, this is not the way that we want to go with our sexuality. We're not saying that this is a healthy sexual ethic of what goes on with OnlyFans. But when we listen, we hear a story that I think is really important. And my research, and you can read this in the book, the people that I interviewed, for example, that left Christianity and went into and developed an OnlyFans, there was a sense in which they had really not developed a sense of their own worth and value and kind of their own, I guess, efficacy before God and before each other in the church. And in our culture, there's no greater affirmation than financial gain. And so the move towards OnlyFans was almost kind of a jump to kind of like, am I lovable? Am I somebody worthy of love and attention and affirmation? Am I somebody who's, desirable? I mean, that's one of
Mhm.
the, I think, crucial pieces of sexuality is like, am I desirable? And like the way in which people can like gain a massive amount of very quickly just from like nobody, like nowhere jobs, can just like jump on there and make a ton of money is pretty. I mean, it exploded over COVID because people lost their jobs and they were home, and so people from all over started jumping onto this platform and creating content and making like two, three, four times even the amount of money they made in their normal job. And people would lose their jobs because they had one on the side. We're seeing a lot of that now, and that just boosted their platform even further. And so essential to the question of OnlyFans, I think, is the question of how are we as a church helping people understand that they are desirable, that they are loved already by God? I think that's a better starting place than just saying like, well, posting stuff online is wrong and you're evil and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think there's either the governor or senator in Florida right now is proposing what he's called a sin tax, because there's a lot of content creators in Florida. And so if you're on OnlyFans, you have to pay 50% of what you make on there to the Florida government as a sin tax.
Hmm.
And so I think that starting the conversation is like, what does it mean to be desired? Like, to be desired to accumulate wealth? Is that what that means? I mean, Rowan Williams, I think, wrote the best 10 pages on human sexuality that's ever been written. It's called The Body's Grace. And his point is that grace for the believer is knowing that we are desired by God, and that the way in which God internally in the Trinitarian life desires the other members of the Godhead spills over into creation for a desire for humanity. And I think that gives itself, and I mean, we're talking on a podcast about cruciform love, that kind of self-giving love towards another, that is this kind of like desire, I think this rubric
Mhm.
for desire that gives us a far healthier understanding of what it means to be desired, rather than merely just, okay, well, I can monetarily give you this money to prove that you are desirable to me, while you then, give yourself to me and then 100 other people or whatever, like that you have to kind of give yourself away like that and whittle it down until there's nothing left, optimize your sexual capital, for lack of a better term, so that you can be more of an earner for financial capital. That's why in the book, the thing that I say is that, like, when it comes to sexual ethics, I think that our sexual ethics has to start with not what acts are ultimately are we going to deem permissible, but what kind of humanity do we see in the love of God? Because then when we locate it that way, it's not a question about just trying to say, okay, well, you've done this, and so you're on the bad list, or you've
Mhm.
done this, so you're on the good list, or you've not done this, and you're on the good list. But to say that each creature is being uniquely loved and cared for by God. We're all just fragile creatures held in God's love. And so, whatever we do sexually with human partners is to ultimately affirm that dignity that's already given to them through the love
Mhm.
of God. And what does that look like? It looks like this kind of, again, this self giving love that gives to one another in ways that affirms their flourishing, that makes promises and keeps them. Again, it affirms their dignity and allows them to be the person that they are called to be in light of who God is. And so I think that's where the conversation should start around OnlyFans, not just to
Mhm.
condemn, because we've done a lot of that and it hasn't quite worked out too well, but instead to ask this question of like, okay, here's how you understand what it means to be desirable. Here's how I understand God's desire for us. And that's a more constructive conversation, I think, than just merely condemning certain acts or certain relationships or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I really like that as a holistic sort of approach to thinking about what is a redemptive view or posture towards this. Where's the grace? Where's the compassion? In order to invite people into that.
Hmm.
And I think that's for, at our church, we've had this ministry for a decade that's gone into local strip clubs
Hmm.
to be a redemptive presence. And the women who've run that have learned a lot. It's called Just Love, right? Because they show up
Hmm.
to love and to build relationships with the women and to provide an alternative to the transactional affirmation that is taking place, right? That
Hmm.
requires the majority of the women a disassociation, right? Create a persona, an avatar, right? It was
Hmm.
just very much like the digital world, but it's in real life that performs and is rewarded and that serves a function. Instead, they're showing up, providing gifts, treating them, being in relationship with them to remind them of the thing you're naming, which is
Right.
you're already loved.
Hmm.
You are already outside of and, disconnected from this reality.
Hmm.
You are loved. We're going to show up and treat you with dignity and as humans.
Hmm.
And that work over a decade has been really beautiful and
Right.
really, really slow for the seeds planted from that to bear fruit, but
Hmm.
they have.
Yeah.
But they have, and that's some of the really, you know beautiful kingdom work that I've seen that's really helped me think about, like,
Yeah.
what you're naming, a different posture towards sexual ethics and
Yeah.
in a world of transactions and exploitation.
Right. Yeah. And it takes a church that has the imagination to say that no matter what you've done, like, I'm not willing to surrender your humanity to something other than the love of God that I am accountable to in the worship space.
Mm.
You know, and that's one of the challenges, is that, like, the lack of imagination to be able to do that kind of thing is something that I think oftentimes prevents us from doing like true kingdom work. I mean, you look at what Jesus did, right? He was around prostitutes and tax collectors. I mean, it's almost like at this point, like you hear that so much now as a
Yeah.
pushback against a lot of Christian culture. But the basic bottom line affirmation is that that is still true. That's what Jesus did. That's why he was so despised by the people around him, because his religious imagination did not include this kind of purity codification that made it impossible for him to do kingdom work. He lived the kingdom work, and that's why the cross is the manifestation of it, because it is the rejection of our religious idols that ultimately leads to that kind of crucified life, is that we prefer our idols, going back to that
Yeah.
comment you made earlier, because they're much more efficient. It's easier to follow a code than to have
Mhm.
to enter into the messiness of a person's life, like in the way that your church is doing, and offer them that alternative from that space of like, you are uniquely loved by God. And I'm here to confess that, whether you do or not, ultimately accept that offer of another way.
Mm.
And our church is so bought up in that language of efficiency, of that language of purity. And I think in the wrong way. I think that we've kind of abused the language of purity that the Hebrew people initially established, you know, prior to the destruction of the temple. But that's another conversation for another day. But again, that
Yeah.
kind of imagination with AI has the exact same kind of thing. It's less efficient, it's less whatever, but it prevents us from doing that kind of kingdom work that you're talking about.
That's good. Hey, well, all right, we barely scratched massive subjects in this conversation, which
Yeah.
means that I'm sure we're gonna have to follow up and have another one. And I have
Yeah.
some other fun conversations scheduled up, so I may have to bring you back as a co-host panelist to talk with some of the other folk that are coming in to talk through some of this. I think you would enjoy some of the conversation. So
Yeah, absolutely.
thanks for your thoughts. Found it really interesting and helpful to me. And we'll see as we push this out if AI loves the fact, if the algorithm loves the fact that we're talking about it and
Yeah.
helps people connect, or if we get shadow banned all over the
Yep.
place for naming what's
Hmm.
going on. So we'll just see what happens with that, and
Yes.
we'll risk it, put it out into the world. So
That's right. Get in the comments, everyone.
that's it.
Get in the
That's it.
comments.
Oh man. Hey, thanks, Hank. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your work and your friendship and your witness in this. And we'll keep following up and have some more conversations around it. So
Thank you, Greg.
thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.